So the topic of delidding Intel CPUs for improved performance in thermals has been pretty popular here on YouTube as of late.
This video is sponsored by our very own WSGF Ultimate Monitor Stand. It's the only monitor stand on the market designed to grow with you and your gaming rig. It supports 3x1 landscape, 1+3 landscape with up to 27-inch panels, and it supports 5x1 portrait with up to 25-inch panels. For more information, visit wsgf.org/stands.
Most of the work has been done on looking at, say, Core i7 Extreme and i9 chips with aggressive overclocks and really heavy cooling. I wanted to take a look at how delidding impacted thermals and performance from a gaming perspective in more of a mainstream setting. And so I got an i7-7700k, and I'm actually using two low-end coolers, a CryoRig C7 low profile fan heatsink. I chose that because I like small builds, ITX motherboards and rigs, small, cool, quiet, and also a Corsair all-in-one H55 quiet for that same reason. So I wasn't going to do the delidding myself, didn't want to screw it up, didn't trust myself, and so I purchased the service from siliconlottery.com that Steve from Gamers Nexus had recommended in one of his videos. Sent the CPU off to them, they delidded it and turned it back around to me in one day. I didn't tell them I was going to be doing it for this video. They haven't paid for any promotion or even known that they were going to be featured here, but they did a great job and it's a great service. So if you're looking to have this done, if you think it's worth it, by the time we get to the end of this video, I would recommend using them. So for the testing, I'm on a Z170 Stinger ITX motherboard. I'm using the two coolers I mentioned before. And for a GPU, I'm running an EVGA 1080 hybrid. And all gaming testing was done at 3440 by 1440 ultra wide with ultra settings in every game. So the first game or the first benchmark we're going to look at is the Ashes of Singularity CPU benchmark. In all of these graphs, the blue line is the CryoRig C7 air cooler before the delid, the white line is after, and then the orange and yellow lines are the two corresponding thermal profiles for the Corsair H55 quiet. The thin line that you see sort of in the background is the actual second by second thermal change of the entire package. The bolded line that's easier to see is a 4-second moving average. I wanted to show the overall thermal movement and profile. One theme that we'll see throughout the whole thing is that obviously the all-in-one water coolers perform better. We get a minor thermal improvement on the air cooler and a more pronounced thermal improvement on the water cooler, but also on the air coolers, the thermals ramp up over time, whereas they tend to stay pretty steady on the water cooler, but with the delidding, it's a much slower ramp. So from here, I'm going to flip through the different results and graphs, so you can pause the video if you want. There's a couple I'll have comments on, but they're all pretty self-explanatory. So this is the Ashes of Singularity GPU benchmark. And then here we have 3 runs of Cinebench back to back. Those valleys in between are the few second pauses. Between the runs, you can see how quickly the chip starts to cool and recover. And you can also see here the much slower thermal ramp on the C7 air cooler after the delid. And then here we have Metro Last Light Redux, the built-in benchmark. This is Prime 95. I did something wrong on the H55 delid testing. I may have run the wrong test, I'm not sure. I didn't figure it out until after I started to compile the graphs, and I'm running the C7 in my rig ongoing because it's so quiet and does an adequate job for my needs, and I didn't feel like tearing the whole thing apart to put the all-in-one H55 back on for this one test, because I can't get to the back plate without disassembling the whole rig. So for the Prime 95 numbers, I would take them all with a little bit of grain of salt because it looks like the first and last step here are probably overstated. Next, we have Superposition. And one thing to note here is the scale maxes out at 70 degrees. This test has a very low CPU utilization and runs much cooler. Sort of the opposite end of the scale with Prime 95, whose graph maxes out at 100C, where all the gaming graphs max out at 80C. This is Total War Warhammer. And then we have here Witcher 3, The Wild Hunt. So in this graph, we're looking at a comparison of all of the tests before and after delidding. So the blue bar, the dark blue bar, and the red bar are the C7 and H5 prior to delidding. The gray and yellow bars are the corresponding results after the delidding. A couple of things to note here is that Prime 95 runs at 100% CPU utilization, as we would expect. Cinebench is almost there at just under 95%. During the testing itself, it's at 100%, and that 5% difference is the gaps between the runs for a few seconds. The Ash's CPU benchmark is about 95% as well, and the GPU benchmark still taxes the CPU up into the 80s. Metro Last Light, we're just under 30%, and then with Total War Warhammer and Witcher 3, we're at 36%, and then Superposition is using less than 9% of the CPU on the 7700K. So kind of like you do with Olympic figure skating, I'm going to toss out the high and the low because I don't think they're really representative. That being Prime 95 because of its overly aggressive thermals, and Superposition because of its under-aggressive utilization. And we're left with just the 6 gaming-related benchmark runs here. And so we can see here a pretty consistent thermal profile between the Witcher, Total Warhammer, and Metro Last Light in particular. We still have Cinebench here. And it's a fairly consistent thermal profile to the Ashes benchmarks, but all 3 of those are still a run much hotter than your average gaming session or experience. So here we're looking at the temperature delta before or after the delidding. The blue bar is the C7 Air, and the H50, and the red bar is the H55 all-in-one. You'll see that on Prime 95 we had very little or a small amount of improvement. I think that's a mix here again because I screwed up the test and because it's such an aggressive use of the CPU. Superposition had a pretty small change as well, particularly with the H55 because it's utilizing the CPU so little. So we'll do the figure skating thing again and toss those out, and we're left with Cinebench and the other gaming-related benchmarks. And you can see here the actual degree delta and then the percent change or the percent reduction off of the delidding thermal average. If we average the averages, or if we average the percent reduction, we can see that the C7 air cooler delidding improved its thermals by 7.7%, and then the H55 improved by 12.7%. And again, remember that these are very low-end coolers for their classes. The C7 is a small form factor and is much more akin to the stock Intel cooler than anything else aftermarket. And then the H55 is at the complete bottom of the stack of Corsair's offerings and is made to run quiet versus having an aggressive cooling factor. So the next thing we'll look at here is I also did some testing with my i7-7700k. One thing to note here, and this applies retroactively as well, is I didn't realize, but the system was applying an overclock that I wasn't aware of. I don't know if there's some auto setting on the motherboard I didn't realize, or maybe the EVGA Precision software that's running for the graphics card, but it gave me an extra 100 megahertz on the i5 and an extra 200 megahertz on the i7 from the stock temps. But what I want to point out here is how much higher Prime 95 is than your average gaming experience and how much lower Superposition is. So any review that you see, in the future that is looking at thermal profiles or cooling or whatever, and is using Prime 95, which is pretty common, recognize that that is not representative of what your gaming experience is going to be. Cinebench is a little higher than your gaming experience, but it is going to be more in line with thermals from gaming. So let's toss out the Superposition and the Prime 95 like we did before. And what we'll see is that the gaming results cluster very close together. And in comparing them to the 6600K, what we'll find is that the delidded i7, especially with the gaming results, is about halfway between the i5-6600K and the i7-7700K. So you can see that there is a lot of thermal constraint that Intel has here with their subpar thermal interface that they're using between a die and the heat spreader. So with all this data, let's take a pass at some conclusions. So it's obvious that Intel is using a subpar thermal interface. I mean, that was already known from the other work that was done. Some of the commentary or sort of conclusions that other people may have looked at was looking at a single user experience. And again, at those aggressive overclocks and with that high-end cooling, talking about the performance that's being left on the table if Intel used a better thermal interface. I'd like to take a slightly different tact on it because there's obviously that. So the use of this subpar thermal interface is adding a hidden cost for the user because of the more aggressive cooling that has to be done. And Steve from Gamers Nexus really hammered that home in his conclusions in his videos. But beyond the individual user, I'd like to point out that a lot of Intel sales are into the commercial space. So if you think of all of the desktops and workstations and servers that are sold to other businesses for running their business and for doing their work, not only are they leaving performance potentially on the table, but they're causing a massive cost, not just a small hidden cost to an individual, but a massive cost to those entities to cool everything down. If you think of something like Pixar and their render farms, or DreamWorks and their render farms, or the workstations of all of their animators, the data centers, that house their render farms are massive. They are huge. And they're not even a drop in the bucket for somebody like Google, or Facebook, Twitter. But if we look at Google, this video is on YouTube and Google owns YouTube. This is what a Google data center looks like. In doing a little Googling and a little research, each rack is 42U, so 42 standard units high. They're using a 2U server, and each server has 2 CPUs in it. That was their standard configuration with the most recent article I could find. So every rack has 42 CPUs in it. 50 racks is 2,000 CPUs for easy rounding, and assuming there may be a few spaces taken up for networking and connectivity and stuff. These data centers have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of racks there, each loaded with 40 CPUs. You're talking thousands and tens of thousands of CPUs that need overproduction to cool them down. This is what Google's cooling looks like. Their water cooling is delivered in massive pipes. Everything is plumbed through the floor. And if you look at Apple and Google, they're building their own power production through solar and buying renewables and that kind of thing. How much more power is being consumed? How bigger of solar farms, or whatever they're called, solar plants, is Apple having to build or Google having to build to do more aggressive cooling because of this subpar thermal interface that may impact you and I just a little bit? But when you're looking at a data center with tens of thousands of CPUs, the scale of this impact really becomes massive. Intel's a huge company. They make billions, tens of billions of dollars in revenue, if I remember correctly, every quarter. I don't think the cost of improving the thermal compound is really measurable. If it's a few cents per CPU and, you know, i5s and i7s at the 1,000 unit buy price are, you know, $200, $300, what's a couple of pennies to that? What's $1 even, if that's what it costs? And I doubt, you know, I wouldn't think it would cost anywhere near that. It's probably pennies or fractions of a penny for a better thermal interface. So when we look at the scale of this business decision globally, I think it's pretty massive. And I think, you know, I don't want to say Intel owes the world, or, you know, but I would think they owe the tech industry to do as good as they could. And I think AMD not being, you know, as big of a performer recently, in the last few years, with the FX series, you know, caused Intel to rest on its laurels, and we saw that a lot, and people have talked about that a lot. And now we're getting the 6 core CPUs in the mainstream, and, you know, they're doing big, huge things that seemingly in response to AMD. But I also think this lack of the details, attention to the details here, or choosing to go, you know, to cut corners in these details, is also indicative of that just being good enough instead of innovating and pushing the boundaries. So do I think you should delid your CPU if you're a mainstream user? I do. I wouldn't necessarily say do it yourself. I would use siliconlottery.com. Again, they're not advertising here. They don't even know that they're going to be part of this video, but they're great people that, you know, provide a great service. It costs about $60 between shipping to them, the $40 service fee, and then shipping it back. But I think you'll make up half, if not all of that, in cheaper coolers. Just looking at, you know, all-in-one coolers from the big names on Newegg, stepping down from, say, you know, a dual fan rad to a single fan easily gets you $30 to $60 in savings. Or maybe going, you know, from a 280 to a 240, or, you know, from a 240, you know, like I said, to a 120. It's easy to make these savings up, in addition to what I believe would be more longevity with your CPU due to having a lower thermal profile, and also a quieter rig because you don't have to have as aggressive cooling. So one more thing that I stumbled across while I was doing this, and just to preview a video that's coming out, or that I'm working on in the future. Forever, essentially, myself and others have said, unless you're a content creator, or unless you are streaming and you don't need all the threads, you're probably going to have a good experience with an i5, and you don't need to spend the money on an i7. Put that money to a GPU and SSD or something. And I think that's still largely true. However, looking at, say, Warhammer and The Witcher 3, both of them show, you know, an average CPU utilization of 36%. However, when we look at the second-by-second details, we'll see that Warhammer on the i5, we do get close to 90%, 85 or so. And in real-world gameplay, you might be hitting that 100% and causing hiccups or snags in your experience, whereas the i7, you know, you're at 40, 45% with plenty of breathing room. The Witcher 3, on the other hand, is a far different story. In just the introductory village, White Orchard I think it is, in making the first run through that village on the i5, there are significant stutters and hangs. And you'll see here in this graph that we're maxing out the CPU multiple times, and initially for a significant period of time at 100%. And it causes massive stutters and hiccups. And even on the second lap through the benchmark, you can see we still hit that spike again. Looking at the i7, it is maxing out at 60% or so. So, you know, we're really trying to get like 120% out of the i5, which it obviously doesn't have. But I may have to rethink that idea of you only need an i5, or an i5 will give you a similar experience at a much improved cost versus an i7. Whereas here, maybe it's because it's an open world game and it's constantly loading objects and geometry and things like that. Whereas something that loads a single level at once, you may not experience or see. I thought this was initially, when I was playing the game, a result of using a Radeon Fury X, it was not quite up to par with the NVIDIA offerings. It only had a 4 gigabyte frame buffer, but here I'm using the 1080, and I'm still getting these big hiccups, and it's obviously from the CPU, with the i5 being overloaded. And so I would say maybe it's time to look at really an i7 for good consistent gameplay with minimum frame rates. I have a handful of other games that I'm going to test at different resolutions and aspect ratios to see where this applies, or if at some point it stops becoming an issue and the GPU really becomes a bottleneck at some point or a constraint, and not just looking to max out minimum frame rates on things like CSGO down at 1080p for competitive gamers or high refresh rate monitors. I'm maxing out an i5 here on Ultra in The Witcher 3 at 3440 by 1440, and that was a surprise. So look for more on that soon. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out. Subscribe, notify, like, all that stuff. Comment below, and see you soon.